can we trust the Bible's historical accuracy when there are many alleged contradictions? The different accounts of Jesus' heritage, for example, and other seemingly contradictory stories with different details, different locations, similar events, but recorded by different authors in different ways. We can't reconcile this stuff, so the Bible must be inaccurate. Case closed. I'm right. All y'all little Christians are wrong. The Bible is just a throne of lies. Yeah, no. Hey everybody, Jake here. Thanks for tuning in. In this series called 20 Questions, I'm digging my teeth into a variety of questions about the Christian faith that every Christian should have an answer for. Today, let's explore some alleged contradictions within the Bible and figure out how to address other contradictions that might come up. Why is this important? Well, because the pop culture take on the Bible is that it's contradictory, not only in its theology, but in its historical and scientific accuracy. The theology I might deal with in a different video. In this video, I want to address the historical reliability of the Bible because, like any religion, if the theology presented in the book isn't based on accurate history, then the foundation of the entire thing starts to crumble. In other words, if you can prove that the Bible is historically inaccurate, that Jesus wasn't a real person, then you've pretty much discredited the entire belief system that goes with it. It's why so many people try to attack the historical reliability of the Bible. So first of all, let's address this from a very general point of view. Let's take the historical books known as the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we could even include the book of Acts, which records the early history of the Christian church. These books have been verified by many secular and Christian historians as trustworthy accounts of the first century church. Now, some people consider the Bible to be nothing more than mythology or fantasy or whatever, but one inescapable truth is that the Bible contains a lot of verifiable history. Anyone who denies that has simply not done their homework, or they have an agenda. Bill Maher. Professor Craig L. Blumberg, author of The Historical Reliability of the Gospels and one of the top philosophers in the world, is one of the many people who has approached the study of the Bible from a purely historical perspective, and he has arrived at the conclusion that it is accurate. When it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Blumberg says that the belief that these books were written by four men who either walked and talked with this man Jesus Christ or recorded testimonies of those who did has never really been in question among serious historians. It's obvious that they did these things when you really begin to study the books in conjunction with other resources. With just a little bit of research, it's easy to verify the accuracy of these books. If you want more insight into this issue, take a look at video number 4 of this series, which talks about the reliability of the biblical authors themselves. Now, these books of history, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, they contain some similar content and even retell some of the same stories, but each retelling reads a bit differently. Some people attack these inconsistencies, believing that any change to any repeated story immediately discredits it. What many people fail to realize is that these changes have less to do with inconsistency and more to do with things like changes in perspective and the way people back then recounted information, which actually does more to confirm the stories than discredit them. Here's how. Simon Greenleaf of Harvard Law School said in his book, The Testimony of the Evangelists, "There is enough of a discrepancy in the Gospels to show that there could have been no previous concert among them, and at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show that they all were independent narrators of the same great transaction. In other words, the perceived inconsistencies aren't really inconsistencies, but are the natural result of having different perspectives." This is how lawyers ferret out liars in a court of law. No two people perceive an event in the same exact way, so when two eyewitness accounts are identical, that actually indicates they have conspired together to coordinate their stories. That's not what you want to hear when you're searching for accuracy. Classical historian Hans Stier agrees. Every historian is especially skeptical at that moment when an extraordinary happening is only reported in accounts which are completely free of contradictions. Professor Mark D. Harris of the Memorial Baptist Church in West Virginia writes, depending on the purpose for retelling a story and the audience that will hear it, speakers choose to emphasize different aspects of a story. Both in medicine and in law, a story that is totally unchanged between events is more likely to be considered a fabrication. And we all do this. We all choose different words based on who we're talking to, even if we're retelling the same story. But let's get down to some examples here. I've been a Christian for almost 30 years, and I can admit there are some parts of the Bible that appear to disagree. But all the ones that I've personally looked at so far have reasonable explanations that aren't too hard to find. These issues range from minor variations in wording to very apparent changes that make it seem like one account or another is liar, liar, pants on fire. Here's an example. Paul's conversion. There are actually 3 accounts of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. The most well-known is in Acts chapter 9. This account is told in the third person, suggesting that Luke wrote it after hearing the story from Paul. Based on what we know about Luke as an exceptionally thorough doctor and a writer, he also probably interviewed Paul's companions to get more details. The story in Acts 9 is pretty straightforward and unbiased. The second account of Paul's conversion is in Acts 22. This is a first-person account given by Paul himself during his trial before the Jews. And in chapter 26, we hear Paul give the story again, but in a much more private setting as he testified before King Agrippa. There are different details of his conversion in each account, leading many to speculate that the story is a fabrication, or in the least, greatly embellished. These people say the differences are too great, and the stories can't be reconciled, but with a closer look, this isn't hard to piece together. In chapter 9, it says, a light appeared, Paul fell down, he heard a voice, his companions heard a sound, not a voice, and they did not fall down. Then in chapter 22, we read, a light appeared, Paul fell down, he heard a voice, his companions also heard a voice, and no mention of them falling down. Then in chapter 26, a light appears, everyone falls down, and Paul heard a voice. No mention of his companions hearing anything. Yeah, okay, some seemingly contradictory details in there, but check this out. Just because Acts 9 doesn't say that Paul's companions fell down, doesn't mean they didn't. All we read of them is in verse 7 when it says they were standing there speechless, which was after the event played out. They might have fallen down prior to this. The verse also says they heard not a voice, but a sound. The New King James translation uses the word voice, but if you look up the definition of the original Greek word, it can be translated as voice, sound, or tone, and is used to describe something that is heard but not understood. So it's clear that Paul's companions heard something, but it was indistinguishable. In chapter 22, Paul says in verse 9 that his companions did not hear the voice of the one speaking to him. The word speaking implies discernible words. This is not the contradiction that many perceive. This is actually correct. His companions did not hear the words of someone speaking. All they heard was a sound, a confusing noise, a voice, but nothing they could understand. In chapter 26, Paul says the bright light caused them all to fall to the ground. And yeah, it probably did. And none of the other accounts actually contradict this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this explanation is airtight, but the point is there's enough reasonable explanation here to indicate that none of this is truly contradictory. Here's another example. The Roman centurion. Matthew 8, 5-13 describes Jesus' response to the request of a Roman centurion in Capernaum. The Gentile officer had a servant who was paralyzed and suffering. The centurion demonstrated a tremendous amount of faith when he approached Jesus and said that he believed Jesus did not need to come to his home, but that he could heal his servant from afar with just a word. This same story is recounted in Luke chapter 7, verses 1-10, but this version says the centurion did not go to Jesus personally, but sent Jewish elders to him instead. That's a pretty big difference, and it has some pretty big implications. If the Roman soldier went to Jesus directly, that shows an incredible amount of humility and faith. On the other hand, if he sent servants, it suggests that maybe he was too scared or embarrassed to be seen with Jesus. And why would the elders even agree to do this? These two differing accounts raise a lot of questions. But think about it like this. In our culture, we have secretaries who work for bosses who serve the CEO. And although the CEO can come into the office and give everyone a direct order, he can also pass his instructions on to a boss who gives it to a secretary who sends out an email to the staff. In the end, though, it's understood by everyone involved that the instructions come from the CEO, even though it was Mrs. Smith in accounting who actually delivered the order. Things weren't all that different in the ancient world, except they didn't have email. The centurion probably had servants who, on his behalf, contacted elders who located Jesus' disciples, who relayed the request to Jesus. But regardless of who ultimately delivered the message, the people of the first century would have understood the request to be coming from the centurion himself. And the narrative in Luke reflects that. So there's nothing wrong with accepting that the story in Matthew and the story in Luke are both correct. One just includes details, the other doesn't. But wait. If the details in Luke are correct, and there's no reason to believe they aren't, the centurion did not go to Jesus personally, but instead sent elders. Does this suggest that the soldier didn't have enough faith? Couldn't he have gone to Jesus himself? First of all, I don't think this story is about the soldier. I think this story is about Jesus and the incredible power we have in him through faith. Second, we don't know what the circumstances were back then. It's likely the centurion had a post that he could not leave, so he couldn't go seek out Jesus for himself, but it's even more likely that he didn't know where Jesus was, and so he relied on his servants to contact some elders who got in touch with Jesus after searching for, 2 or 3 days. If you really want to make the story about the soldier, I think both versions of the story demonstrate a huge amount of faith. You see, with just a little bit of research, it's not hard to reach a reasonable conclusion to these apparent contradictions. The demoniac. In Mark 5, 1-20, we read the story of a man who had been possessed with many demons. He is often referred to as the demoniac. The story is told again in the books of Luke and Matthew. The versions in Mark and Luke say that when Jesus cast the demons out of the man, he sent the evil spirits into a herd of pigs at Gerasa, while Matthew says it happened in Gadara. These are two very different locations, making this seem highly suspicious. Professor Craig L. Blumberg, who I cited earlier, said in the book The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, here's one possible solution. One was a town, the other a province. There have been ruins of a town that have been excavated at exactly the right point on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The English form of the town's name often gets pronounced Karasa, but as a Hebrew word translated or transliterated into Greek, it could have come out sounding something very much like Gerasa. So it may very well have been Karasa, whose spelling in Greek was rendered as Gerasa in the province of Gadara. Something like this does take a little extra digging, especially when it comes to the many difficulties in translating ancient languages. But still, a reasonable explanation isn't hard to find. Okay, one last contradiction I'd like to look at, even though it would be fun to do this all day. The genealogies of Jesus. This is a discrepancy that just keeps coming up, no matter how many times people and scholars, historians try to explain it. And that is the seeming contradictions in the genealogy of Jesus, as listed in the books of Matthew and Luke. This is yet another instance of both accounts being correct. Most scholars seem to agree that Matthew reflects the lineage of Joseph. As Jesus' adoptive father, Joseph would have been his legal ancestor through whom Jesus' royal lineage would have been traced. The book of Matthew is very interested in the topic of Jesus' kingship, so the genealogy he provides is very focused on the lineage of his earthly father. The book of Luke, on the other hand, traces the genealogy of Jesus' mother, Mary, or so many say. Now, some people say that both genealogies are actually a reflection of the ancestry of Joseph, but one focuses more on his human heritage and the other more on his legal heritage. The lists can be hard to figure out because the years of translating names from one language into another has resulted in some spelling variations of certain individuals, but that doesn't mean a perfectly rational explanation can't harmonize the two accounts to some degree. The main point of these genealogies is to underscore Christ's humanity and his royalty, while at the same time demonstrating that he is also the Son of God. But that's another conversation. Okay, so what? Finding these explanations doesn't prove that everything in the Bible is true. That would be too easy, but here's the thing. When incidental details like this confirm certain historical or geographical details of a passage of Scripture, this increases our confidence that the other material within the passage is also correct. If I tell a story about going to the movies in Crestview, Florida to see Spider-Man Far From Home, and that I ordered Raisinets and popcorn at the concession stand, and that the projectionist skipped ahead on the digital reel on 2 separate occasions, spoiling the reveal of Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire before half the audience got up and stormed out, investigators could then visit that movie theater, find out if they even served Raisinets and popcorn, find out if that movie was even playing at the theater at the time I said I was there. They could find out who that projectionist was, find out why he spoiled the 2 biggest plot points in the entire movie, and send him to jail for the rest of his life. And if only half of the details of my story check out, does it prove my entire story? No, but it does enhance my reputation as a reliable source, thus making my story believable. And just so you know, that story is true, and I will never go to that movie theater again. Historians use this method all the time. For example, when it comes to the stories of Alexander the Great or Hannibal, we have very little accurate historical information about them or their campaigns. There are only 2 trustworthy accounts of Hannibal crossing the Alps, one from a Greek historian named Polybius and a Roman historian named Titus Livius, who were born 20 years and 160 years, respectively, after the event. These accounts contain some contradictory details, but no one denies the broad strokes of the story. Similarly, much of what we know about Alexander the Great is unreliable and steeped in myth. His story wasn't written down until hundreds of years after his death, yet most historians accept the tale of his conquests as relatively accurate. But they won't do the same with the Bible, even though it has proven historically accurate time and time again. Why? #rhetorical question. Look, sorting out each alleged discrepancy in the Bible would take a very long time, but the more you learn about how the historical books of the Bible were recorded, the easier it is to see these alleged errors not as inconsistent with each other, but as complementary to each other. And there's a lot you have to take into account to do this. You have to consider the type of culture and people that these accounts came from. You've got to understand when a narrator may be speaking publicly as opposed to privately and how that will influence the retelling. You've got to understand how historical accuracy comes not always from accounts that are identical, but rather accounts that come from different perspectives. You have to recognize that not every story is going to be a beat-for-beat retelling of exactly what happened. Sometimes the story is abridged or paraphrased. If the narrator is Luke or Matthew, the story is probably very precise. If the narrator is someone like Paul, it will probably read more like a sarcastic first-century TED Talk. But that doesn't mean it's not accurate. There are many more facets of this discussion that I would love to get into, and other alleged discrepancies I would like to just debunk. But look, Christians need to have an answer for the question of how do we explain these perceived contradictions in the Bible. And so I hope this video has given you some good places to start as you begin to form your own answer. If it did, please give this video a like, maybe consider subscribing, because I've got a lot more rambling content just like this coming out soon. Thanks for watching. Until next time.